Welcome back, everybody. This video is going to be a little bit longer because I'm going to be inviting you to pause quite a lot, and I'm going to be inviting you to watch 3 particular videos in the course of watching this video. So I have lots of browsers open on your computer. So the whole thing will take a bit more time. Child protection, a current social work discourse. I'm going to give you some European perspectives today. I'm going to stick with the country I know best, the case of England. Also give you an interesting case from Norway. I think we have some particular European concerns, and I'm going to talk about the preoccupation. It's a friendly way of saying fixation, a preoccupation with risk. That will be our topic later on today. So I'm going to look at Britain and Norway. We'll be investigating UK and Norwegian child welfare in the media for quite different reasons. It's a real topic in both places right now for quite different reasons. Starting with the case of the UK. I want you to view video number 1. It's a short clip, it's only 2 minutes long. It's an older clip. We'll be seeing UK politicians debating in Parliament. You'll recognise the UK, the London House of Commons. The context is worth me explaining. This is not from 2020, it's from 2008. And the context is you're going to see a couple of guys debating rather energetically. One is a greyish black-haired gentleman. He was the Labour Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. He followed Tony Blair as Prime Minister, and he was only Prime Minister for a fairly short time. The other person in that debate is David Cameron. You might recognise him. He was the Prime Minister that had the Brexit idea a few years back. Back then, he wasn't yet Prime Minister. He was speaking then in his role as leader of the opposition to the government, the Conservative opposition. So that's for context. Have a look at that clip. What are they debating? Try and piece together the details of this particular case using the language that they do. But also, when you discuss it with your partner, how do you find this? You know, I'm guessing you're both German-born. You know, comparing it to your Bundestag debate, would it be the same in your country? Is this kind of political debate how it would work over here in Germany? So think about that whilst you watch the clip. Pause here. How did you find that video? I think it's fairly fascinating, isn't it? I mean, something very strange is going on here. What are they debating? Something really very horribly shocking and sobering. We're talking about a baby who died. And the baby that died as a result of physical abuse. Strictly speaking, the baby wasn't a baby at all. The baby was in the toddler years. The child was 17 months old, I think, at the time of its death. Social services were involved in the protection of that child, as were other professionals from healthcare, from the police force and so on. So there were various professionals involved. However, the debate between these two politicians was focusing on the social work role. In particular, Cameron, as leader of the opposition, was pointing his finger and saying this social services department, that's the kind of the British equivalent of a Jugendamt in Germany, the social services department has an enormous budget and is unable to protect its children. So the politicians were kind of making a political discussion about this tragic case of a toddler dying. Would it be the same in your country? I certainly hope not. I mean, this is what happens in other countries. It's certainly no way to make public policy. And the fact that we were using it in that way was itself, you know, a scandalous thing and actually a sign of broken politics in the area of children and family services. Some of my students from other countries might say, hey, you know, you couldn't have that debate in that form in my country. And if that's the case, good for you. So watching it as a British-born person, you know, I feel strange feelings of shame watching those politicians clashing in that way. I'm going to talk about that case in the course of this video presentation. So we need some background information. What is UK social work like? Before I progress, what do you know about social work in different countries? So in a minute, I want you to pause, discuss with your partner, what is social work like? Let's generalize a little bit. Well, you know, what is the social policy context for social work, and how does that shape UK social work? What did you come up with? The social policy background is really quite clear. Esping Anderson famously categorized social policy regimes or systems. There's different kinds of welfare state, and Esping Anderson identified a particular kind of the liberal welfare state, which Britain is typical of. of, and Esping Anderson noted, welfare entitlements are very, very strict. They're stigmatized. So welfare really is help for poor people, but claiming that help is itself a stigmatizing thing to do. And in liberal regimes, much of our welfare is actually private responsibility. You know, we can afford it. We get ourselves private insurances for various forms of welfare. That's the social policy background. What kind of social work does that make? Lorenz, in his survey from 1994, he described social work as being very much residual. You know, it's at the edges. You know, it's not a central part of society. It's pushed to the edges. Minimal services. You know, don't think of generous family services, helping families with their child raising. Minimal services, the basic minimum. And it does have a stigmatizing character. You know, if you do see a social worker, you wouldn't say to your neighbor, oh, I had a nice chat with my social worker last week. You know, social work is a stigmatized profession because of that residual context. And again, to summarize the general character, limited social work services, really only for the poor and the very needy. And when people receive those services, they're stigmatized in doing so. So social work has, you know, quite a different character to how it has a character in Germany. You know, it really is not the same profession. In the UK, services supporting families, traditionally they're separated into two areas. We tend to split family services into what we call family support and what we call child protection. Family support services, they're meant to be preventative, they're meant to be proactive, you know, really promoting the interests of families. Not a reaction, but rather, you know, proactive prevention. In contrast, child protection is by its very nature a reactive thing. In recent decades, particularly in the 21st century, family support services really have been inadequately resourced in the UK, you know, in terms of money, in terms of time. Child protection has dominated UK social workers' resources to the extent that UK social work for families really is child protection in the eyes of the general public. And we've had repeated child protection failings, perversely, grotesquely, leading to an even greater focus on child protection. So there's some kind of weird paradox going on here. Actually, we want to have more family support, but we don't have the resources for it. And because of the failings of our child protection, we're having even more child protection. So there's a strange kind of vicious circle that's visible, that's evident in the case of the UK. And my case, which dates back 12 years, really is an example of this. The death of baby P, later revealed to be a child named Peter Connolly. This hit the news in the year 2008, in the autumn of 2008. An inquiry investigating his death, something like a year earlier, 2007, suggested considerable failings on the part of professionals. In particular, social workers were largely criticised in the report. So in terms of the media response to this report, social work was talked about most of all professions involved in that child's care. The story dominated television news broadcasts and papers. I walked into the train station in Cologne one November morning. Cologne's a really international German city, and they would have the full range of British newspapers laid out in a row. Really every one that you could get in London would all be lined up there, something like 12 newspapers. And each one of these papers that day had the same story, the Peter Connolly baby P story, on the cover, typically with the same photo of this child as well. So it really dominated the media on that day, in that week, and actually for months to follow. The story came up again and again. Politicians discussed the case, as you saw in that first clip. Experts discussed the case. The public discussed the case. This was in everybody's mouths. And it really caught the country. I almost had kind of strange feelings of 10 years earlier when Lady Diana died, and there was this public mourning and public grief. It seemed to be almost the same thing happening in Britain. I'm going to show you a news clip. So this is our video 2, the second clip I've got for you. It's something like 9 minutes long. Have a look at it, discuss it with your partner. How do you find the reporting of the story? The BBC are actually famous for excellent journalism, but some of my students are quite critical of their journalism here. So think critically about the quality of the journalism. How do you find the portrayal of the social work profession? You know, what does it say about us social workers? Does it give us a good standing, a good light? And what consequences did such media representations of social work have? So a bunch of questions to natter with your neighbour about. But the clip, if you've watched the clip now, I'm guessing you have, it's sobering stuff, isn't it? It really is quite unsettling to watch that clip. As a social worker, it's painful viewing. The scene which really shocked many of my students was when we have an image of the Sun newspaper cover, kind of the broad equivalent of our Bild Zeitung in Germany, isn't it? So it's not famous for high quality journalism, but it is a paper read by the public, and they had a kind of petition, a campaign to get various social workers fired. Data protection law in Britain is really shockingly loose. And we actually had photos of 3 of those 4 social workers that they were asking to have fired, photos actually on the front page of the Sun newspaper. And that really sent a shiver down my spine. The details of the case obviously are shocking, and that would be the same in every country. But the reaction to this and the kind of blame game that you had in the UK, you know, everybody was pointing the finger at the people that they thought were responsible. It's really disturbing stuff. And of course, social work was not really able to defend itself. You know, it wasn't really defending itself as a profession in that news clip. So there's a whole bunch of consequences of that. You know, social work cannot have the confidence that it needs as a profession if that's how it's going to be represented in the media. And it won't surprise you to hear that social workers left the profession in the months that followed. You know, it was considered to be almost too stressful to be a social worker on the streets in that post-BBP climate, in the difficult aftermath of that news reporting. So, you know, it's gloomy viewing. I know it's disturbing television, and it says a lot about how social work in the UK was, and to some extent still is. We're obviously addressing a particular problem. In the case of the UK, social workers are under fire for not taking action, for failing to take action, for not responding quickly enough to child protection concerns. Behind all of this is, of course, you know, a painful lack of resources. That was also clear in the BBC News clip. The council in question didn't have enough social workers on the streets to actually do the casework that was needed of them. So an under-resourced social work team being unable to comprehensively protect children. Let's move over to another part of the world where social workers are not so famous for being under-resourced. Let's have a look at Nordic social work. I'm going to give you a particularly interesting case from Norway shortly, but let's look more generally at Nordic social work first. And the same questions like I asked a few moments ago. I gave you some generalizations about British social work. It's residual, there's not much of it, and it's kind of pushed to the edges. It's stigmatizing when you get it. You know, how is it in other places? How is it in the Nordic countries? What do you know about Nordic social work? And again, what you know about Nordic social policy will probably take you halfway there. Well, speaking about social policy, Espen Andersen, himself Danish, he knows in the Nordic countries. Am I going? I might still be going. I'm going to continue anyway. Bear with me. I've lost my screen. I'm just going to try and get my screen back. Hey, here we are. Sorry about this interruption, guys. Let's hope this is still recording. Espen Andersen notes. Oh, I've still got a technical issue. Bear with me. Now I'm back. Espen Andersen notes we have the social democratic welfare state. We have welfare entitlements which are generous. We have extensive family services. And when you claim family services in the Nordic countries, they're very much non-stigmatizing. The state has worked hard to provide so many services, but it's almost normal to be getting some kind of help in your child raising. Notable feature of child welfare in the Nordic countries, they have a mandatory system of reporting for child abuse. So it's illegal to keep child abuse secretive in these states, and there's obviously legal situations where practitioners will be reporting on child abuse. So there's a particular policy there, and in comparative social work, this idea of mandatory reporting is considered to be a fascinating marker of a system's characteristic. I should also mention, passing children's rights really are very, very strongly protected in the Nordic countries. They were the first, for example, to ban smacking, to ban corporal punishment of children. I think Sweden banned smacking back in the late 1970s, Finland and Norway following that in the years that followed. Even before the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child banned corporal punishment, the Nordic countries were creating laws to ban that anyway. It's very child-friendly societies. And to summarize for general character, we're talking about preventative services, supporting families, non-stigmatizing services. And I'd like to stress this idea of children's rights being particularly energetically, proactively promoted. So that's the conceptual background, that's the context here. That's the kind of social work we're talking about when we think of a country like Norway. However, and here comes the but, Norwegian child welfare hit international news for quite a different reason from the UK social services. The story here is quite surprising. Heavy-handed child protection, removals of children from their families against the wish of family parents. And the reporting of this in the media, uses very strong language. One of my students had read about it in her own home country, often involves migrant families, and she described it as being child kidnapping. And that really is a phrase that's often used. So removals, the main reason for the removals are, of course, harmful parenting, problematic parenting, or forms of child abuse. But we noted migrant families were overrepresented in this removals policy. So they were losing their children, having their children taken into care against their wishes more than non-migrant families. I've got another video for you to watch. This is a slightly longer reportage. I think it's something like 20 minutes long, from the BBC, Our World, Norway, Parents Against the State. Once again, when you watch that with your partner, what's going on here? Can you explain the thinking behind these removals? Pause now and watch that short news reportage. What did you think of it? It's quite fascinating, isn't it? I'm a great admirer of the Nordic welfare system. I love the idea of having comprehensive family services. And I also like the idea of preventing children with as much energy and comprehension as possible, really having the most excellent network of support to protect children. In a weird kind of sense, that seems to be part of the problem here. Maybe the social workers in Norway are having almost the opposite problem to the UK social workers. In the UK, social workers are under fire for not intervening, for not making that removal. In Norway, they're under fire for making the removal too early, too soon. So in a strange kind of sense, it's actually the other side of the same story. And we have a rather strange phrase, but we can say in these difficult dilemmas, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And comparing the British experiences and these Norwegian concerns, you can kind of see the truth in a phrase like that. So obviously, despite the big differences in the social work systems, the big differences in terms of the policy, the problem ultimately is the same one. The problem is about how social workers are encouraged to think about risk. For me, both the UK and the Norwegian examples, they illustrate a public concern with risk, an enormous public concern with risk. The public have an expectation that social workers are able to assess risk in their social work practice and assess this with 100% efficiency, foresee any risk before it happens. So we have a kind of public expectation of that, reinforced by the media, which is there to pounce and report if mistakes are made. And for me, in a weird kind of sense, that the British and the Norwegian experiences are almost two sides of the same coin. I've used the term assess risk just now. Modern European trend here in our social work, systematic risk assessments to minimize the risk of harm. Risk assessments. A range of risk assessment tools have been developed. If you're interested, it's well worth going online and just entering the term into your favorite search machine, and you'll find some of these tools. There's like PDFs, which are catalogs of questions. You can download them. Countries make their own risk assessment tools public. So you'll find a fair number from the English-speaking countries. Typically, these are catalogs of questions that social workers need to ask themselves. And the idea is that the questions relate to risk. And if you're saying yes as an answer to lots of these, maybe the risk is going to be higher. The concept of the risk assessment, I understand, comes from criminology, it comes from psychiatry, thinking about clients who are in some sense dangerous. I understand the concept then migrated to social work at a later point. When I came to Germany, there was no German word for risk assessment. It's quite fascinating. I tried to explain what it was to my German social work colleagues. And in terms of language, it was almost impossible to do. And they would say, oh yeah, we know that from criminal justice work, but we don't know it from my children and family social work. Ironically, in the last 15 years, these tools have very much arrived in the German social work scene. Going back to the case of countries like the UK, you have these tools. And then we have around these tools procedures, a whole bunch of procedures to respond to and to reduce risk. In the particular case, you would have procedures. You must have professionals meeting in a case conference at this time scale. But also in a more general sense, the social services departments will be having regular audits, regular inspections to make sure that their procedures are working well. So you've got this whole kind of complex, kind of a whole framework of procedures around these risk assessment tools. So for me, this is another kind of current discourse, the idea of measuring risk. Your views. Practicing is founded on the idea that we can scientifically measure, scientifically understand levels of risk to the welfare of a child. In the same way that a doctor looking at an X-ray photograph and seeing the broken bone, we're expected to foresee the risk of events that may happen to a child in their life. And this idea has become international. We're expecting a kind of 100% accuracy in our risk assessments. Discuss with your partner, how do you find this idea of using risk assessments in social work? Are you okay with it? Some of my Fechter students are social work managers. How do you find it from your management perspective? And a final question, is this risk orientation in social work a good thing? I won't answer these questions now. I'll leave those questions with you. If you're interested, there are alternative models to this looking for risk process that we have. There's a fascinating concept called signs of safety, invented by a particular social work professional. And again, you can investigate that. Maybe it's a nice flip side to this risk perspective. Let's come to a close now. There's some fantastic literature in this area. Two of my favorite books, Learning from Baby P, very, very exciting read, well worth picking up. And Paul Michael Garrett's interesting book here, Transforming Children's Services. Both give you really rich insights into some of the questions going around in the UK, over the last 15 years or so. Let me come to a close. I hope you've enjoyed these videos. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for your interest.